Andrew Yang's universal basic income is a proposed reform to government benefits. I think that's the first clarification that's necessary for any discussion of this policy proposal and what it means in terms of poverty, social inequality, social justice. Whatever you want to do to try to sell or oversell this policy, you have to recognize that what it is very fundamentally is a reform to food stamps, a reform to social benefits. Now, many people since Milton Friedman, I'm not saying Milton Friedman was the first, but especially since Milton Friedman popularized it, many people have suggested that government intervention to help the poor would be made more effective if you simplified it and just gave poor people cash. So stop giving them government benefits like food stamps, stop involving them in complex programs with a lot of strings attached that have distorting effects on the economy and limit the choices they can make and make it hard for them to relocate from one place to another. People who say, keep it simple, stupid. What the poor need is money, so therefore the government should give them money. And then they argue in terms of efficiency or positive outcomes. You're better off scrapping, getting rid of a whole complex bureaucracy of helping the poor and just help the poor by handing them cash. So that case can still be made. The cure is only going to be good relative to the illness. If you live in a country that is unbelievably corrupt, where the government programs to intervene to help the poor are opaque and inefficient and difficult to access, there are serious problems with it. The worse those problems are, the more appealing the option will be of abolishing them and replacing them with tax. Now, I think there are probably some countries in Europe that would say, no, we have really wonderful programs here that help the poor, and this just isn't true. It would be much worse for the poor if we got rid of these programs and just handed them cash. However, whether you're looking at first world countries or third world countries, you could indeed have examples where the way the government is helping the poor is so counterproductive, so corrupt, so bad in various ways that it would be better to replace them with cash. So that's the kind of minimalist underselling of the program, where all you say is, hey, this is a way of reforming social services for the poor. This is a way of reforming food stamps and other benefits so that basically you're putting cash in people's pockets and letting them make the decisions about how they're going to spend that cash to try to improve their lives, whether that's to get out of poverty or go back to school or whatever it is they're going to do. However, the policy is being oversold, is being presented as if this is an yet untested route to social justice, greater economic equality, the uplifting of the downtrodden classes of the world, and as if this is preparing humanity for a transition to a troubling new future in which robots, owned by a smaller and smaller number of multimillionaire capitalists, control more and more of the economy. So the scaremongering tactic here is that somehow we now live in a technologically accelerated age. And in this new age, unlike the past, there is a natural tendency for power and wealth to be accumulated in the hands of a small number of people who do not rely on many employees, do not rely on mass employment, and then those people just get richer and richer, and everyone else is just paying a portion of their income to these people every time they make a purchase on Amazon. Some of that money is going to the master of robots, and the robots scurry around the warehouse, and the people buying these things are endlessly enriching this elite class of technologically enabled aristocrats, whatever you want to say. Yeah, and supposedly this scenario is going to be cured by handing out $1,000 a month to every man, woman, and child in America. Well, gee, that sounds like a really complex problem with a suspiciously simple solution. I'll tell you something else, too. This is a terrible example of new era thinking. The problem is not new. The problem has been with us since Aristotle. There was a time on this channel when people used to joke, every time he mentions Cambodia, take a shot of whiskey. Every time he mentions Laos, take a drink of beer. These days, you could have a drinking game where you got to take a shot of whiskey every time I mention Aristotle. I do recommend reading Aristotle. I do not recommend drinking alcohol. I'm a teetotaler. I'm against all mind-altering drugs. But hey, Aristotle I am not just mentioning him for the sake of it. I genuinely and sincerely feel that Aristotle's politics and Aristotle's Constitution of Athens work like that. It's really meaningful. It really prefigures the questions, and even within that era in ancient Greece, they even tested out some of the possible answers to the problems we're still struggling with today. Okay? So we're going to talk about poverty. We're going to talk about government interventions to alleviate poverty. We're going to talk about social inequality. And I'm going to talk about racism briefly because it helps to illustrate this same problem that existed since Aristotle in ancient Athens. Okay? Canada was colonized by Europeans. Genocidal, slave-trading Europeans showed up and displaced the native people. Some of them were enslaved. Some of them were forced onto reservations. They took the land, and this is now much mythified and much celebrated. There was a period of time in which white European conquistadors gave the land away for free. Things would be very different today if they had given the land back to the native people they'd conquered it from, but no. You literally signed up to have land given to you by the government, and you had to be basically a white male European or other. And it was debated. It was debated how narrow the racial standards would be, who would and who wouldn't be allowed to apply for this free land. I should also mention really briefly, Canada only embarked on that distributionist methodology after other methods failed. Earlier, what they tried were so-called colonization corporations. That actually wasn't the government's first method. Something similar is true in the history of the United States, by the way. This normally comes up in the history of slavery, that there were several different models for how colonization should work. And then the first 2 or 3 really didn't work out at all. And then they were like, oh, okay, you can grow tobacco, enslave Africans. You know, they started to put together the pieces of what became, the model of genocidal slave trading and exporting crops to Europe, this combination of economic factors for how the continent was colonized. But in any case, giving away free land to people, something that happened once, right? If you were of the right ethnic group at the right time in history, you got land given to you. And more recently, if you were of the right ethnic group and you showed up, you had the chance to buy land at low prices. Centuries go by, and guess what? The descendants of these families still own land. They're still receiving rent. Some of that land is now worth billions of dollars. And regardless of the hypothetical value of the land, if you sell it, the land is generating income year after year after year through rent. Now, the problem of rent, basically all economic textbooks will say rent is irrational. Rent is economically irrational. I'm not going to digress into saying what that means. If you have an apartment building on a small piece of land, you're basically looking at technology amplifying a problem that already existed in ancient Athens, in ancient Greece, when Aristotle was alive. Okay, arbitrarily, a small number of people own land. They're making money from the land, whether that's rent or farming or through something else. But in our times, rent, it's really rent that's the terrifying technology here, not robots. No matter what happens to the economy, those people continue to get richer and richer. The rentiers, the rent collectors, continue to get wealthier and wealthier. And the people who pay the rent, they may be the poor getting poorer. You may have this, classical formulation of the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. They may be successful middle-class people who enjoy their whole life. They may not even complain about the rent. But nevertheless, a portion of their income every month is devoted to making the same wealthy aristocratic class wealthier and wealthier forever. Food stamps will not change this pattern. Offering people cheaper admission to university, offering them scholarships, will not change this pattern. Giving people $1,000 a month, Andrew Yang's universal basic income, will not change this pattern. If you live in Western Canada, who do you pay rent to? Not the indigenous people. We've had myriad government interventions to try to help our genuinely poor, genuinely oppressed genuinely downtrodden indigenous people. A lot of government money going into that. Mysteriously, the indigenous people never end up becoming the aristocrats again. They never end up becoming the landowners. You never end up redistributing the ownership of the land, right? So already in ancient Athens, this was obvious to Aristotle, that the most fundamental problem of democracy was that if you let the free market operate over time, a small number of families would own all of the most valuable land, whether the system started that way or whether it ended up that way after some number of decades or centuries, right? They would then be collecting rent from pretty much everybody else, the rich and the poor. You can have wealthy people paying rent, middle-class people paying rent, poor people. Everyone's paying rent. Not everyone is collecting rent. And then you get, in effect, all of the defects of aristocracy, oligarchy, plutocracy, whatever you want to say. And you have the illusion of opportunity within this system. You know, you can say to people who are in the disadvantaged ethnic group, you could say to someone today who's Cree or Ojibwe or Dene or Mohawk, someone who's an indigenous person in Canada, you can say to them that they have the opportunity to become a dentist. And that's true. It's like, okay, today you have educational opportunities, you have scholarships, you have maybe some government money being put into this. Say, hey, look, you can become a dentist and you can earn a good living. That's true. However, when you take a step back and look at the society as a whole, when you look at the fundamental inequality and injustice that society isn't based on, they're two different things, but they're related. There's a question of injustice here. There's also a question of inequality. You have this aristocracy that for no good reason is remaining, and it's not just static, it's not just remaining powerful, it's becoming more and more powerful over time, regardless of how many people manage to lift themselves up out of poverty by becoming a dentist. Okay? Now, yes, there is some economic instability within capitalism. Some small number of poor people become dentists. Some small number of multi-billionaires lose all their money because they make a bad choice at the stock market, or they become a cocaine addict, something like this. And then once in a while, some poor person who became a dentist took his money as a dentist and put it into real estate and ends up owning a whole bunch of condominium towers, starts charging rent to people, owns apartment buildings. And then they join that rentier class, right? So it is true, it is not a completely static aristocracy. However, you have to recognize, even if there are extraordinary individuals who are extraordinary in either their upward mobility or their downward mobility, the same pattern perpetuates itself forever and ever, unless and until you have political decisions, you have government policies, or you have a revolution that intentionally disrupts and destroys that pattern to replace it with something else, replace it with something better. And never forget, aristocracy as a social system also had upward mobility. Aristocracy also had downward mobility. There were aristocrats who went bankrupt, who ended up poor, and there were poor people who ended up crawling their way to the top of the pile in aristocracy. If you read primary source historical documents, they're full of examples of that. I mean, everyone likes to write stories about the self-made man, even if it's rare. Within every society that has a massive literary corpus, you get recorded examples of how people manage to get rich, how people manage to get aristocratic titles, whether through industry, war, even scientific inventions, what have you, by doing an extraordinary service to the king, etc., etc. There were forms of upward social mobility in the medieval world and in every aristocracy that I know of. Andrew Yang's proposal ultimately shows the futility of government subvention. The misleading thing here is the concept of help. If you hand out $1,000 per month to all the poor people, do you help the poor? Yes. If you provide cheap or free university education, do you help the poor? Yes. Even, the United States is very significant. Employment in the military helps the poor. It's probably the single most successful, quote-unquote, socialist policy within the United States is actually the U.S. military and all the healthcare benefits poor people get with that. The U.S. military is a way out of poverty for many, many people in the United States of America. Unfortunately, help as such is irrelevant to the more fundamental question that's raised by Aristotle. Who is to rule and who is to be ruled in this society? Okay? We live in a society now which has been utterly lacking in the type of disruption, the type of redistribution of land that Aristotle regarded as an integral part of every polity, every political community, as a fundamental obligation of democracy, to redistribute wealth to prevent its accumulation in fewer and fewer hands. And I'd point out that this is not an end in itself. It's not the case that equality is desirable simply for abstract or arithmetic reasons. Okay? This kind of equality, which is never going to be an absolute equality, it's never going to be a perfect equality, this redistributionist approach to coping with extreme inequality, the fundamental reason for it is that arbitrary and irrational wealth leads to arbitrary and irrational power and arbitrary and irrational powerlessness in society. It leads to a kind of constant injustice that the society as a whole must inevitably want to rebel against, that everyone, even comfortable middle-class people, must in some way suffer to bear. Okay? In the United States of America, since the abolition of slavery, you never redistributed land. You know, the famous phrase, they never gave the African Americans 40 acres and a mule. If you want the native people of Canada to really have an equal chance with the white wealthy people of Canada, you would have to actually redistribute the land to them. You would actually have to give them ownership of land, and not in remote and worthless areas that they were pushed out onto because the white people took all the land that had gold and all the land that was good for farming and all the land that they wanted to build cities on. No, you'd have to give them ownership of land in downtown Toronto and downtown Vancouver and actually have them enter into the free market on that basis as landlords, not as tenants paying rent. And from my perspective, race and ethnicity is ultimately meaningless. It just provides a marker for the extent to which these irrational and arbitrary inequalities persist over time. One of the fundamental reasons for the French Revolution, I'm talking about First French Revolution, 1789, was that people ceased to regard as virtuous the excuses made for aristocracy. They ceased to think it was a wonderful thing to be ruled over by people whose ancestors happened to fight on the right side of a war that nobody could now remember 300 years earlier. Okay? The idea of having a perpetual endowment of superior political rights on the basis of military heroism that your great-great-grandfather might have been responsible for, that was no longer a morally coherent basis for the society they lived in, and everyone wanted to rebel against it. By the same token, the idea that extraordinary political privilege, extraordinary political power should rest in the hands of someone because their great-great-grandfather showed up at the right time to buy a cornfield that today has a condominium tower on it in downtown Vancouver, downtown Montreal. The fact that you happen to be a blood descendant of someone who was in the right place at the right time to buy land when it was worthless, land that today is worth billions of dollars and generates millions of dollars in rent year after year after year. Again, rent being fundamentally economically irrational, rent that fundamentally makes the rest of society poorer and makes a tiny elite richer and richer. In a sense that is even more morally incoherent than the excuses for aristocracy in ages gone by.